The cane struck the polished floor 3 times before the laughter began. Lord Edward Ashford had taken no more than 4 steps into the Vale ballroom when Lord Felix Crane moved a chair. Not dramatically, not with any visible intention, just enough. A small shift of mahogany across marble, as if making room. Edward reached for the armrest that should have been there. His hand closed on nothing. He went down hard, one knee on the floor, his cane skidding forward, his gloved hand slapping marble to catch what little dignity a fall allows a man in public. The musicians played on for one more measure. Then the melody died. And then, where silence should have lived, laughter. Not from everyone, not from the whole room. That would have been too honest. It came in pieces, a stifled breath from the left, a low sound behind a fan. A whisper turned into a smirk along the row of chairs where the young gentleman stood watching. Lady Agnes Shaw said nothing. She only looked at the woman beside her, and both of them looked away from Edward with the particular cruelty of people who have decided not to notice a thing they are already enjoying. Edward's jaw tightened. He pressed his palm to the floor. He had done this before, gotten himself up, rebuilt his posture from the ground. But tonight the whole ballroom was watching, and no one moved toward him.
Why does
Not
no
the
one
footman,
help?
Not the host.
I must
not
rise
one
alone.
gentleman in the room who had spoken to him warmly 20 minutes before, when he had still been standing upright and looking useful to acknowledge. Clara Bell was standing at the far edge of the room. She was not a guest. She was employed, a paid companion to Mrs. Hargrove, and her instructions for the evening were simple. Stay near your employer. Fetch refreshments when asked. Do not draw attention, and above all, do not embarrass the woman who pays your wages by making a scene. Clara had kept every one of those rules for 3 years. She was very good at being invisible. She crossed the ballroom before her employer could stop her. Not running, there was no panic in her steps, but fast and direct, cutting through the frozen crowd like a woman who had already weighed the cost and decided it was acceptable. She reached Edward, knelt without ceremony, retrieved his cane from where it had slid against a chair leg, and placed it back in his hand. She did not hover. She did not speak softly to him the way one speaks to a frightened child. She simply helped him to his feet, stood straight beside him, and turned to face the room. The laughter stopped, not because the room felt shame, because Clara Bell was looking at them as though she expected them to. That was gracious of you. The voice came from the left, smooth as glass and cool as a blade. Lady Victoria Crane stood 3 feet away, her ivory gown unmarked, her expression perfectly constructed, not cruel, not kind, just amused in the way of a woman who has never been corrected in public and does not expect to begin tonight. Mrs. Hargrove will want you, Victoria said, and I imagine you know where you belong this evening. Clara looked at her. She did not look down. I know exactly where I belong, Clara said. At the moment, I believe I was needed here. Somewhere near the musicians, standing apart from the drinking men, away from the card tables, unremarkable in plain dark clothing, with no title attached to his name. A man had watched every second of it. He stood very still. His name, to everyone in that room who had noticed him at all, was Mr. Henry Grey. A minor gentleman, someone's cousin perhaps, easy to overlook and easier to forget. He had been watching the ballroom for nearly an hour, and he had made a careful study of it. He had noted who greeted his brother warmly and who offered a thin smile and moved on. He had noted who made space and who quietly took it. He had watched Felix Crane's hands twice, and both times he had not liked what he saw. Now he watched a woman in plain dress hold her ground against one of the most socially dangerous women in the county, and something shifted behind his careful expression. He did not move. He did not speak. He filed away the names of everyone who had laughed, everyone who had looked away, and the one woman in the room who had done neither. He would need that list before the night was over. Before we go any further, I need to ask you something. If you had been standing in that ballroom tonight, If you had watched a man go down on that polished floor and heard the laughter spread through the crowd, what would you have done? Would you have stayed in your place, protected your position, kept your eyes forward? Or would you have crossed that floor, knowing every eye would follow you, knowing the cost might come due before the night was out? Clara Bell knew the price. She had counted it in 3 steps. Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from tonight. Please like this video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and follow for more stories. Your comments and support help more than you know. Now, let us get back to the story. Clara's hand was still on Edward's cane when the ballroom remembered how to breathe. The musicians had started again, something light and forgettable in a major key. And the crowd had turned back to its wine and its whispers and its careful performance of not having laughed 30 seconds ago. The floor resumed its elegant motion. Candles burned without opinion, and Clara Bell stood beside Lord Edward Ashford with her employer's gaze cutting into her back like a letter opener, slow and deliberate, and understood that she had already spent something tonight that she would not get back. She did not regret it. Not yet. "You may release the cane," Edward said. His voice was even. Not cold, not warm. It was the voice of a man who had practiced saying reasonable things while his teeth were pressed together. Clara looked down. Her fingers were still curled around the handle, just below his. She let go. "Forgive me," she said.
You are forgiven.
He adjusted his grip, set his weight, and looked at the room the way a soldier looks at ground he has already lost. "You may also stop watching me to see if I will fall again." "I wasn't. You were." She opened her mouth, closed it. He was right, and they both knew it. Edward Ashford was 24 years old and had spent the better part of 10 years learning to read the expression people wore when they looked at him and believed themselves too polite to show pity. He had catalogued every variation: the soft eyes that slid away too quickly, the smile held 1 beat too long, the slight forward tilt of a person preparing to offer help that had not been requested. Clara Bell had the tilt. She had corrected it once he spoke, but it had been there. "I did not come to your assistance because I thought you helpless," Clara said, keeping her voice low enough that the nearest guests could not hear without leaning, which they were already doing. "I came because a man was on the floor and no one else was moving." A fine distinction. It is the only distinction that matters. Edward studied her for a moment. She was not beautiful in the way that rooms noticed. No particular arrangement of features designed to draw attention, but she had a quality of stillness that made her seem older than she was. She did not fidget under his gaze. Most people did. "You are a companion," he said, "not a guest." "Yes." "And you crossed the floor anyway." "Yes." He said nothing for a moment. Then something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural beginning of one, the kind that gets cancelled before it fully arrives. "That was either very brave or very foolish," he said. "I expect it was both," Clara answered. "It generally is." 30 feet away, near the tall windows where the drapes pooled on the floor and the candlelight did not quite reach, a man in plain dark clothing stood with a glass he had not touched and watched the room conduct its recovery. Henry Ashford, Mr. Henry Grey, for the evening, had chosen his position carefully, near enough to the musicians to have a reason for standing still, far enough from the card tables that no one would press him for conversation. He had a clear sight line to 3/4 of the ballroom, and he had been using it. He had arrived an hour before Edward. That had been the arrangement. Henry came first, established himself as Mr. Grey, a minor acquaintance of Sir Martin Vale's, which was true enough, technically, and observed. Edward came later, announced under his own name, which was also his own name, because Edward had refused to travel under a false one. "I am not ashamed of who I am," Edward had said in the carriage on the way here. "If you want to run an experiment on human decency, you run it. I will simply attend a ball." Henry had not argued. He rarely won arguments with Edward about dignity, because Edward had thought about dignity longer and harder than Henry had, and his positions were better constructed. What Henry had not told Edward was that he had attended 4 events in the past 3 months, under the name Mr. Grey. He had watched how rooms behaved when they believed the Duke of Ashford was not present. He had watched men who called on him at Ashford House and praised Edward's courage, laughed behind their hands at a man with a limp in a public room. He had watched women who brought Edward flowers after his injury speak of him in doorways as a tragedy, a shame, a burden wearing a good coat. He had not yet decided what to do with what he had learned. He was still learning. Tonight he had learned something new. He had watched Felix Crane move the chair. He had been watching Felix for the past 20 minutes, because Felix had the quality of a man waiting for something to happen. A particular stillness in the body, a readiness around the eyes, and Henry had learned to read that quality early. Felix had timed it precisely, a small adjustment, a casual hand, the kind of action that could be described afterward as accidental by anyone who had not been paying close attention. Henry had been paying close attention. He had also watched Clara Bell cross the floor. He had noticed her earlier in the evening, not for any particular reason, only because his attention moved to people who stood apart. She was stationed near the far wall, with an older woman he recognized as Mrs. Ruth Bell, a widow of modest means, whose connection to the Vale household was the kind of tenuous social thread these evenings were made of. Clara had been quiet, correct, and utterly ignored, which was precisely the position she was employed to occupy. She had left it in about 4 seconds. Henry watched her now, speaking to Edward in low tones, and Edward's shoulders, which had been carrying the hard set of a man steeling himself against the room's opinion, had dropped, very slightly, into something more natural. He made a note of that. He also watched Lady Victoria Crane, who had not moved from her position 6 feet away, and was now speaking to Lady Agnes Shaw with the low, unhurried confidence of a woman laying track for a train that had not yet left the station. Miss Bell. Mrs. Ruth Bell had crossed the room with the speed of a woman propelled by anxiety rather than intention. She arrived at Clara's elbow with her color high, and her smile fixed in the particular formation of someone performing calm while feeling nothing of the kind. "Come," she said, not quite a whisper. "Mrs. Hargrove has been asking for you." "In a moment, Aunt Ruth." "Clara." The word was quiet, but packed. A whole conversation compressed into 2 syllables. "Not here, not now, not like this. You know what is at stake, please." Clara knew. She had always known. That was, she sometimes thought, the particular difficulty of her position. She understood the stakes better than anyone, which made it no easier to accept them. She looked at Edward. "Lord Edward," she said, "I hope the rest of your evening is less eventful." "Given the start," Edward said, "I find that unlikely." For just a moment, something real crossed between them. Not sympathy, not gratitude, but recognition. 2 people who had both learned to read a room quickly and were, for reasons entirely different, always standing slightly outside it. Then Clara turned and followed her aunt, and Edward turned back to the ballroom, which was pretending it had never looked at him. Mrs. Ruth Bell moved with purpose through the thinning edge of the crowd, pulling Clara after her by proximity and tone rather than physical force. She found a corner near the supper room door, where the noise of the main floor was muffled and the candles burned lower. "Clara," she said, "what were you thinking?" "I was thinking a man had fallen, and no one was helping him. He is Lord Edward Ashford. He has staff. He has a household. He does not require the assistance of. He required it this evening." Clara kept her voice even. There was no one near him. "That is not the point." Mrs. Bell pressed her hands together in the way she did when she was frightened and trying not to show it. She was a gentle woman, Clara's father's sister, kind in the way of people who have learned that the world is sharp and have adjusted by becoming soft against it. She had taken Clara in when Clara's father died, and that act of kindness had bound them both in a way neither had fully planned. Lady Victoria Crane spoke to you. She did. And you answered her. I did. Mrs. Bell closed her eyes briefly. Mrs. Hargrove heard. She is not pleased. Clara looked at her hands. I know. We cannot afford. Her aunt stopped. The sentence didn't need finishing. They both lived inside what they could not afford. The specific details were familiar. The lodging that cost more than it should. The clothing that needed to last another season. The employment that was not unkind, but was never quite secure. The thin line of their situation stretched a little thinner every time something like this happened. I will speak to Mrs. Hargrove, Clara said. And say what? That I acted without thinking. That it won't happen again. The words sat unpleasantly in her mouth, but she arranged them anyway, because her aunt's face needed arranging first. Mrs. Bell studied her. Will it happen again? Clara did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. Clara. Her aunt's voice dropped to something genuinely afraid. We have almost nothing left. Do you understand me? Almost nothing. I cannot. She stopped again. I cannot do this twice. Do you hear me? I hear you, Clara said quietly. She meant it. She always heard it. She simply could not always obey it. The supper room was not yet open, and the corridor beside it was dim and quiet in the way of service passages, functional, unloved, and temporarily empty. Clara had stepped into it to collect herself before returning to Mrs. Hargrove, which was a thing she sometimes needed. 3 minutes of not being watched, in order to remember who she was without an audience. She had been in the corridor perhaps 90 seconds when she heard the footsteps. Lord Felix Crane filled the doorway without urgency, as tall men often do, not squeezing into a space but occupying it, letting the space reshape itself around him. He was handsome in the way of men who have always been told so. A pleasantness of feature that sat poorly next to the expression currently wearing it. He looked at Clara the way men of his kind looked at women of her kind, which was to say he did not look at her very much at all. His gaze passed over her face and settled somewhere just past it, as if she were a piece of furniture that had inconvenienced him by being placed in his path. Miss Bell, he said, Lord Felix. I hoped I might have a word. She waited. You've had an interesting evening, he said it pleasantly, which was worse than if he had said it otherwise. Edward has a tendency to create scenes. He doesn't mean to, of course. It's simply the nature of things. Lord Edward fell, Clara said. Someone moved a chair. Felix's expression did not change. Accidents happen at these gatherings. The floors are very polished. He paused. What I wanted to say, and I say it in a spirit of genuine advice, is that Lady Victoria found your behavior this evening quite remarkable, and Lady Victoria has a long memory. I'm sure she does, Clara said. I want to make certain you understand what that means. Still pleasant. Still calm. You are employed by Mrs. Hargrove. Mrs. Hargrove moves in the same circles as Lady Victoria. Those circles are not, as I'm sure you've noticed, very large. He tilted his head. A word from Victoria at the right moment is a very significant word. It can close a great many doors. He let that settle. I'm not threatening you, he added, in the tone of a man who absolutely was. I'm simply observing that one act of misplaced sympathy is not worth a great deal of sacrifice. Is it? Clara looked at him steadily. She was calculating. She could not help it. The distance between where she stood and what she had standing behind her, which was approximately nothing. Her aunt's face, the number in the household account, the rooms that needed paying for. Thank you for your advice, Lord Felix, she said. He smiled. Good night, Miss Bell. He left. Clara stood in the dim corridor for a moment after his footsteps had faded, her hands pressed flat against her skirts. The old discipline, the one drilled into her since childhood. Be invisible, be useful, be small, don't cost anything, pulled hard at one side of her. Something else pulled at the other. She had seen Felix's hand move that chair. She had not been certain before. She was certain now. The ease with which he had delivered that warning, the absence of any guilt in it, the calm with which he had named Lady Victoria like a weapon. That was not the manner of a man who had witnessed an accident. That was the manner of a man who had arranged one and was tidying up afterward. She straightened, returned to the ballroom. Henry had watched Felix Crane enter the service corridor. He had watched the door. He had counted the time. He had watched Felix emerge with the clean expression of a man who had said what he meant to say. He had not followed. He had considered it and decided against it, because following would have required explaining why Mr. Henry Grey, a minor gentleman with no stake in any of this, felt moved to insert himself into a private conversation between a lord and a companion. He could not afford that particular transparency, not yet, but he had watched the door. And when Clara Bell emerged from the corridor 60 seconds later, shoulders set, chin level, the expression of a woman who has been warned and is choosing not to be afraid of it, Henry felt something shift in his chest that he had not expected to feel tonight. He had come here to observe, to record, to collect evidence of what people became when they thought no title was watching. He had not come here to be surprised by anyone. He stood at the window and let the ballroom noise wash around him and thought about what Clara Bell had cost herself this evening, and what she clearly intended to keep costing herself, and whether she had any idea how much danger that particular habit of courage was about to bring down on her. She did not, he thought, and he could not tell her, not as Mr. Grey. He turned back to the room. Across the floor, near the fireplace, Edward was seated now, cane in hand, speaking to a young curate with the careful animation of a man determined to have a normal evening, in spite of everything that had already happened. Victoria Crane stood with Lord Peter Shaw near the east door, speaking in a low, continuous tone, and Lord Peter kept glancing at the room in the way of a man receiving instructions he planned to carry out. Henry refilled his untouched glass from a passing tray and went back to watching. He would not reveal himself tonight. There was more cruelty here than he had been prepared for, and Clara Bell was standing directly inside it. And if he showed his hand now, whatever was being planned would go underground, and he would never find the shape of it. He needed to see the machinery working before he could dismantle it. He needed names, actions, witnesses. Edward would not thank him for protecting him from a distance. But Edward was not the only one who needed protecting tonight. Henry watched Felix Crane accept a glass from a footman and raise it in quiet salute to Lady Victoria from across the room. Victoria, without moving, smiled. Henry made his decision. He was not leaving until he understood what they were planning next. The music had changed twice since Edward's fall, and neither piece had improved the atmosphere. Clara noticed the cane's absence before she noticed anything else. She had returned to her position near the wall, delivered a careful apology to Mrs. Hargrove, who accepted it with the tight-lipped satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting for it, and spent the following 20 minutes being invisible. She was good at invisible. She had practice. She stood slightly behind Mrs. Hargrove's left shoulder and watched the room the way she always watched rooms, quietly, completely, and without anyone noticing she was doing it. It was how she had seen Felix move the chair. It was how she now saw that the place beside Edward's seat, where the cane had rested against the chair leg during his conversation with the curate, was empty. Edward was still seated, still talking. His hand rested on his knee in the posture of a man who has not yet reached for something he expects to need. But the cane was gone, not fallen, not shifted, gone. The floor beside the chair was clean and bare, and the curate was gesturing about something theological, and Edward had not looked down yet, and Clara had perhaps 30 seconds before he did. She began moving, not fast. Fast drew attention. She moved at the pace of a woman crossing a room for an unremarkable reason, which was a speed she had spent years perfecting. She reached the far side of the fireplace, past the cluster of guests around the supper room entrance, got close enough to see clearly. No cane, no sign of it. She scanned the floor in a 6-foot radius. Nothing. She straightened and looked at the room instead. Lord Felix Crane was at the card table. He had been there for at least 10 minutes, which meant he had not moved the cane himself. Or he had moved it before taking his seat, which was equally likely. Lord Peter Shaw was near the drinks table with his back to the wall. Lady Agnes Shaw was repositioning herself in the way she always repositioned herself when something of social interest was about to occur, closer to the center, fan half raised, eyes performing disinterest they were not feeling. Someone had the cane, or had moved it, or had handed it to someone else. Clara looked toward the cloakroom entrance and filed the location away. Then she looked at the floor again, the line of it from Edward's chair toward the door, and felt the particular cold clarity of a person who has just understood that what happened earlier was not finished. "You have been looking at that chair for some time." The voice came from her left, and it belonged to no one she had spoken to this evening. He was standing a careful distance away, not crowding, not performing casualness. A man in plain dark clothing with a glass he clearly wasn't. Drinking from the same unremarkable figure she had clocked near the musicians earlier. He had good eyes, not warm exactly, but attentive in a way that most eyes in this room were not. "I'm looking for something," Clara said. She did not ask who he was. She would ask that second. "Lord Edward's cane," the man said. She looked at him properly now. "You noticed, some time ago." "Then why?" Clara said, keeping her voice even and her expression polite. "Are you telling me instead of doing something about it?" A pause, brief but real. "I beg your pardon. You have been standing near those windows since before Lord Edward arrived," Clara said. "I noticed you when I crossed the floor earlier. You watched everything that happened. You watched Lord Felix at the card table and Lord Peter at the drinks table, and you are watching me now." She tilted her head. "You are a careful observer, Mr. Gray," he said. "Henry Gray, Mr. Gray." She studied him. "I do not know what your interest in this evening is, but you have been watching long enough to have acted before now. Forgive me if I find the observation a little late." Henry looked at her. Something moved behind his careful expression. Not offense, not quite amusement. Something less comfortable than either. "You are very direct," he said. "I am employed," Clara said. "I do not have the luxury of being indirect. It takes too long and costs too much." "Fair," he said quietly. "Do you know where the cane is?" "I have a suspicion about its direction," Henry said. "The cloakroom attendant accepted something from a footman approximately 12 minutes ago. I could not see what." Clara looked toward the cloakroom entrance, then back at him. "And you did nothing?" "I was determining the shape of things before acting." "The shape of things," she repeated. "Lord Edward will reach for that cane within the next few minutes. When he finds it gone, he will have to ask for assistance or attempt to cross the room without it, in front of every person who laughed at him an hour ago." She looked at Henry with the patience of a woman explaining something to someone who is more than capable of understanding it and has simply chosen, so far, not to. What part of that shape requires more time to determine? Henry was quiet for a moment. "The cloakroom is to the left of the main entrance," he said. "If I were to retrieve something from there, I would need a reason to be near that corridor." "Then think of one," Clara said, and turned back toward Edward before Henry could respond. Edward found the absence 3 minutes later. His hand moved to the chair leg with the automatic confidence of a man reaching for something that has been in the same place for the past 2 hours. His fingers closed on air. His posture shifted, not dramatically, not with any visible alarm, just the small recalibration of a person whose body has just informed him that the landscape has changed. He looked at the floor. He looked at the chair. He looked at the curate, who had not noticed and was still talking. Bless him. Then he looked up. Clara was already there. She was not holding the cane. She had not had time to retrieve it, but she was standing 2 feet away, which meant he did not have to look around the room to locate a friendly face. "It is not on the floor," Edward said quietly. "No question in it." "No," Clara said. "Moved. I believe so." He absorbed this, his jaw set. "How long?" "I noticed perhaps 4 minutes ago. I am working on it." The curate, realizing the conversation had shifted, looked between them with the expression of a man who has belatedly understood he is standing at the edge of something he does not have the context for, and excused himself with admirable speed. Edward looked at the empty space beside his chair, and then at the middle distance, and Clara watched him do the calculation she recognized, the one that ran. "How do I cross this room? In front of these people? In a way that costs me nothing they do not already have." "I do not need you to fetch it for me," he said. "I know. I am aware that you mean well. Lord Edward." She kept her voice low but clear. "I am not standing here because I think you need managing. I am standing here because someone deliberately removed your property to cause you difficulty in public, and I am angry about it, and I have nowhere else to put that anger at the moment." A beat. Edward looked at her. The hard line of his expression shifted by a fraction. "You are angry," he said, "considerably. On my behalf." "On behalf of basic decency," Clara said, "which happens to intersect with your situation this evening." Something in Edward's face changed then. Not softening exactly, because Edward did not soften in the way of people who have never had reason to be hard, but a kind of opening, as if a room that had been shuttered for a long time had one window unlocked. "People speak of my leg," he said quietly, "as though it took my mind with it." "I've noticed," Clara said. "They speak loudly and slowly and with great patience." He said the last word the way one says a thing that has become an insult through overuse, as if the distance between a man's knee and his brain were short enough for one to affect the other. "It is remarkable ignorance," Clara said. "It is very common ignorance," he said. "Which is worse." "Yes," she agreed. "Common things are always harder to fight." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I graduated from Oxford." "Did you know?" "Did not. Classics. With distinction." He said it without pride, because it had moved past pride into something that needed stating simply, the way one states the dimensions of a room. "Felix Crane was in my year. He achieved a pass. Barely." His eyes moved to the card table. "He has never once spoken to me about anything that required thinking." Clara followed his gaze. "He moved that chair deliberately," she said. "I know, and someone moved your cane. I know that too." He looked back at her. "The question is what to do about it." "The cane is being retrieved," Clara said. "As for the rest, I don't know yet. But I am thinking about it." Edward studied her face for a moment with the careful attention of a man deciding how much to trust something he has not trusted in a while. "Miss Bell," he said, "I did not catch your employer's name earlier." "Mrs. Hargrove. And does Mrs. Hargrove know you are standing here?" "She does," Clara said. "She is not pleased about it, and yet here you are, and yet here I am." He almost smiled. This time it got further than before. Henry retrieved the cane. He had approached the cloakroom with a mild inquiry about a hat he had not left there, and in the course of that inquiry, identified the cane leaning against the inner wall behind the attendant's stool. He had explained calmly that the cane belonged to a guest who required it and had asked him to collect it. The attendant had handed it over with the unquestioning efficiency of a man who had been tipped well and had no investment in the drama of his employer's guests. Henry carried it back across the room with the same unremarkable pace Clara had used earlier. He brought it to where Clara was standing with Edward and offered it without ceremony. Edward took it. He did not thank Henry effusively. He looked at him with the measuring assessment of a man receiving something that should never have been necessary to retrieve, and said simply, "Grey, was it?" "Yes, my lord, you were near the musicians earlier." "I was. Did you see who moved it?" Henry paused 1 beat, no more. "I'm still determining that," he said. Edward held his gaze for a moment, then nodded once, with the expression of a man accepting an incomplete answer that he intends to revisit. Clara looked at Henry. He looked at her, the small, shared knowledge of people who have done something together and have not yet agreed on what it means passed between them, and then both of them looked away. Victoria Crane had been watching Clara Bell for 20 minutes with the focused patience of a woman who had decided on a direction. She said so to no one in particular, which meant she said it to Lord Peter Shaw, who was standing at her left shoulder, performing the function he usually performed at these events. Listening, agreeing, and understanding that his social position was maintained by the quality of his agreement. "She is ambitious," Victoria said. "It is the only explanation." "Quite," said Lord Peter. "A paid companion does not cross a ballroom floor and address a lord without expectation. Women in her position do not take risks without calculating the reward first." Victoria lifted her glass. "She has identified Edward as a sympathetic figure. She is making herself visible to the right people." Lord Peter glanced toward Clara. She did seem genuine. Victoria looked at him. "That is," he amended, "that is what she would want it to seem." "Exactly." Victoria returned her gaze to Clara. "Henry has been watching her, has he?" "Don't be obtuse, Peter," the man in gray near the window. "He has been watching her since she crossed the floor. He retrieved the cane for her." A pause. "I don't know who he is yet, but he is interested in her, and that is either very useful or very dangerous, and I have not decided which." Lord Peter nodded with the gravity of a man who has been told what to think and is integrating it. "Felix," Victoria said. Felix Crane appeared at her other shoulder with the ease of a man who had been waiting to be summoned. "She needs to be made to look improper," Victoria said quietly. "Not cruel, improper, ambitious. Let it be known she has been throwing herself at Edward, and when Edward didn't respond as hoped, she transferred her attentions to any available gentleman. It wants no invention. It wants only to be said." She turned to Lord Peter. "You know Agnes Shaw." "Very well," Lord Peter said. "Then you know what to do with a well-placed word." She walked away before either of them could answer, which was how Victoria Crane conducted most of her instructions. Delivered, and already departed, leaving no opportunity for discussion or objection. Clara did not know the plan had been made. She knew the room's temperature had changed, in the way she always knew these things, not from any single signal, but from the accumulation of them, the recalibration of angles, the way certain eyes moved past her, with studied disinterest that was not quite natural. She had lived at the edge of rooms long enough to feel a shift in how she was being seen without being able to name the specific mechanism of the shift. She had returned to Mrs. Hargrove. She had been quiet and useful and correct. She had fetched a glass of water and agreed with Mrs. Hargrove's opinion of the floral arrangements, and kept her expression smooth. She had also watched Lady Agnes Shaw cross the room twice and stop each time near a different cluster of guests, and both times the cluster had rippled slightly, the way clusters do when a new piece of information has been introduced. "Clara," Mrs. Hargrove's voice was low and had a new quality in it. Not quite cold, not quite uncertain. "Lady Agnes has said something rather peculiar." Clara waited. "She suggested that your behavior this evening toward Lord Edward was not entirely motivated by concern." Mrs. Hargrove paused to allow this to land. "She implied you were attempting to draw attention to yourself, that you had." She used the phrase "made a display of yourself." Clara kept her expression even. "Lady Agnes did not observe me this evening until after I had already helped Lord Edward to his feet. That is what I thought. Nevertheless," Mrs. Hargrove looked at her. "I have worked very hard to maintain good standing in this circle, Clara. I do not." "Mrs. Hargrove," Clara said, "I helped a man off the floor. Whatever Lady Agnes Shaw is saying about my intentions, she is saying it because Lady Victoria Crane asked her to, and Lady Victoria asked her to, because I declined to apologize for it. She paused. I am sorry for any difficulty it brings to you. That difficulty is being deliberately manufactured, and I think you know that. Mrs. Hargrove looked at her with the uncomfortable expression of a woman who does know something and would prefer not to. Be careful, she said finally. I am always careful, Clara said. It simply isn't always enough. She should have gone back to the wall. She should have stationed herself at Mrs. Hargrove's shoulder and been invisible for the remaining 2 hours of the evening, and let the manufactured whispers run their course, and trusted that the truth of what had happened was plain enough to survive one night of Lady Agnes Shaw. She did not. She saw Victoria Crane cross the floor toward Edward with the smooth momentum of a woman who has selected a destination, and she watched Victoria stop beside Edward's chair and say something, and she watched Edward's expression close like a door. Clara moved. She reached them as Victoria was finishing a sentence about what a shame it was that some people were so uncomfortable in society that they required constant attention. Lord Edward requires nothing of the kind, Clara said. The group around them, 3 guests who had drifted over with the social instinct of people who sense a scene forming, went quiet. Victoria turned with the slow, controlled grace of someone who is not surprised, but intends to seem so. Miss Bell, she said, I was not speaking to you. You were speaking about me, Clara said, which is close enough. I was speaking about the difficulty of navigating public spaces with complications. Victoria's eyes moved to Edward's cane and back up, the transit of a fraction of a second, but pointed. You mean Lord Edward, Clara said clearly, and I believe you are perfectly capable of saying so. Victoria's expression did not change. A different kind of woman would have shown anger. Victoria showed nothing but a small elevation of interest, the expression of a hunter noting that the animal has moved in an unexpected direction. You have a remarkable certainty about yourself, Victoria said, for a woman in your position. My position, Clara said, is standing beside a man who has been mocked, had his property removed, and is now being spoken about in the third person while he sits directly in front of you. She kept her voice level and her hands still. My certainty has nothing to do with position. It has to do with the plain fact of what has happened this evening. The 3 guests were very still. Edward had not moved, but his eyes were on Clara with an expression she could not fully read. You are making a scene, Victoria said. There is already a scene, Clara said quietly. I am simply the only person naming it. She knew there would be consequences. She walked to the edge of the room, behind the column near the second window, and pressed her back against the wall and breathed. Her hands were not shaking. She was surprised by that. They should have been. She heard the footsteps before she saw him. Felix Crane. Again, he was not smiling this time. The pleasantness had come off like a coat. That was very foolish, he said. I imagine it looked that way to you, Clara said. You challenged Lady Victoria, in public, in front of witnesses. He looked at her with something that had moved past social threat into something less managed. I told you what a word from her means. I told you clearly. You did, Clara said. And I heard you, Clara said. And I watched Lady Victoria speak of Lord Edward as though he were an inconvenient piece of furniture, and I made a choice. Felix stepped closer, not touching, not threatening in any visible way, just closer, in the manner of men who understand that proximity is pressure. You have nothing left to lose after tonight, he said. Do you understand that? Mrs. Hargrove will be spoken to. The Vale household will be spoken to. Every house in this county that might employ a companion will be spoken to. He said it without heat, which made it worse. You will not find another position worth having. I will make certain of it. The wall was solid behind her back. The column was close on her left. She was, geographically and socially, cornered. She looked Felix Crane in the face. Then I suppose, she said quietly, I had better make certain what I did tonight was worth it. A figure appeared at the edge of the corridor. Caleb Stone, broad-shouldered, still as a man who has learned that stillness is its own kind of authority, stood at the far end of the passage. He had the look of a man who had walked somewhere for no particular reason, and found himself here, which Clara suspected was not entirely accidental. Felix looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Felix. The calculation took about 2 seconds. Felix smoothed his jacket, reapplied the pleasantness, and walked away. Clara let out a breath. Caleb Stone did not approach. He simply remained where he was for a moment, nodded once in her direction, and then walked back the way he had come. She stood alone in the corridor and understood, with a cold and specific clarity, that she had made an enemy tonight who was not going to resolve himself by morning. She also understood that somewhere in this ballroom, someone was watching the same machinery she was watching, and had sent a man to a corridor to make sure she was not alone in it. She did not know who. She walked back toward the ballroom. Behind her, the corridor was empty. Ahead of her, the candlelight burned warm and false over a room that was already preparing its next move. Henry stood at the window and watched her come back through the door, and felt the cold certainty settle in his chest that she was going to be punished before he could prevent it, and that he was running out of time to determine how far the cruelty was prepared to go. He did not have much longer to wait. Lady Anne Vale announced the missing brooch the way she announced everything, with perfect composure and a smile that had no warmth in it. She stood near the fireplace at the room's natural center, where the light was best and the acoustics carried, and she said that she was certain it was nothing, only a small matter, only that her emerald brooch, the one her mother had left her, the one she wore every season, seemed to have been mislaid somewhere in the house this evening. She was sure it would turn up. These things always did. She only mentioned it, so that if anyone had seen it, they might let her know. She said mislaid. She said anyone. She did not say Clara Bell's name. She did not need to. Clara felt it before she understood it, the shift in the room's attention, the way a current changes direction underwater, invisible at the surface until you are already moving with it. She felt the eyes before she tracked them. She was standing near the east wall, slightly behind Mrs. Hargrove, and she became aware that the space around her had changed quality, the way air changes before weather arrives. She looked up. Lady Agnes Shaw was looking at her. Lady Agnes said nothing, made no gesture, registered no expression. She simply looked, and then looked away, and said something to the woman beside her. And that woman looked too. The current had a name now, and Clara was in it. Mrs. Hargrove made a small sound beside her. Not quite a word, something quieter and more frightened than a word, and moved a half step to the left, which was a half step away from Clara. And Clara felt that half step with a precision that had nothing to do with distance. Henry watched Lady Anne's performance from across the room and understood its architecture immediately. The word mislaid, the lack of accusation, the open invitation for information. It was beautifully constructed, a statement that made itself look like an inquiry and put the accusation in the room without anyone having to make it, which meant no one could be blamed for making it, which meant it could run unchecked while wearing the costume of concern. He looked at Felix. Felix was at the card table, his back to Lady Anne, apparently absorbed in his hand. He had not turned around. He had not reacted. That was confirmation enough. Henry looked at Victoria. Victoria was listening to Lady Anne, with the attentive sympathy of a woman hearing about a missing brooch for the first time, which she was not. Then Henry looked at Clara and saw the half step Mrs. Hargrove had taken, and saw Clara's face absorb it. The slight steadying, the controlled stillness of a person receiving a blow they had half expected, and felt something heat behind his ribs that had nothing to do with patience. He stayed where he was. He stayed where he was because Felix had glanced across the room, just once, in the direction of a footman near the supper room door, and the footman had looked back and Henry needed to understand what that exchange meant before he moved. He watched the footman. The footman was young, 19 or 20, with the pale, careful expression of someone trying very hard to be invisible. His name, Henry had learned from a brief conversation earlier in the evening, was James Pike. He had been positioned near the supper room door for the past hour and had not moved from it. He was not watching the room with the easy boredom of a footman on duty. He was watching it with the specific, compressed anxiety of someone who knows something and is hoping very hard not to be asked. Henry filed that away and returned to the room. Lady Agnes Shaw had begun to move. Agnes Shaw's genius, if it could be called that, was velocity. She did not spread information so much as release it. A word here, a look there, a small intake of breath at exactly the right moment, and let the room's own machinery carry it forward. She had been doing this for 30 years, and she was very good at it. The word traveled faster than she did. By the time she arrived at a new cluster of guests, it had usually already been there waiting. Within 10 minutes of Lady Anne's announcement, the current in the room had found its direction. Clara Bell had been in the retiring room earlier in the evening, at approximately the time Lady Anne had last worn the brooch. Clara Bell had been causing difficulties all evening, drawing attention to herself, challenging Lady Victoria, inserting herself where she had no business. Clara Bell was a paid companion of no family and limited means, and women in such positions had been known, when under financial pressure, to make regrettable decisions. No one said this to Clara. No one said it loudly or directly, or in a form that could be answered. It was said around her, past her, in the specific way of rooms that have decided to treat a person as already guilty and are simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. Clara heard the shape of it without hearing the words. She stood at the edge of the room and felt the geometry of her situation rearrange itself and understood that whatever she did next would be used as evidence. If she moved, she was fleeing. If she stayed still, she was waiting to see how much they knew. If she spoke, she was defensive. If she was silent, she was guilty. There was no move that helped her. There was only the choice of what kind of trapped she wanted to be. She chose to stand still, because stillness at least was hers. Miss Bell. Lady Victoria arrived beside her with the quiet momentum of a woman who had been working toward this moment for some time, and had no intention of rushing it now that she had arrived. "I hope you won't take this badly," Victoria said. "I am only thinking of you." "I very much doubt that," Clara said. Victoria absorbed this without reaction. Lady Anne is distressed. These things happen at gatherings, of course, but this particular piece has sentimental value, and the house will need to be searched. She paused. "I understand you were in the retiring room this evening." "I was," Clara said, "for perhaps 5 minutes. 2 other women were also present." "Of course," Victoria said, in a tone that made the "of course" mean its opposite. "And those women are known to Lady Anne's household. Whereas you," she let the sentence rest there, incomplete, which was more damaging than finishing it. "Whereas I am not wealthy," Clara said. "That is what you mean." "I mean nothing of the kind." Victoria's expression was perfectly sorrowful. "I mean only that in situations like this, it is useful to account for everyone's movements, for everyone's sake, including yours." "My movements are perfectly accountable," Clara said. "Then you'll have no objection to answering any questions Sir Martin may have." Victoria looked at her with the expression of a woman who has placed a piece on a board and is watching it land exactly where she planned. "For your own protection, of course." She walked away. Clara stared at the space she had left and felt the cold that follows when a door has been closed that you did not know was still open. Edward had not spoken for several minutes. He had heard, not the words, but the direction of them, the way they were clustering around Clara's name, like weather around a peak. And he had absorbed this information with the particular fury of a man who knows he is being used as part of a mechanism he did not consent to join. He turned to the man beside him. Henry, still Mr. Gray, still plain-coated, still carrying the glass he never drank from, had positioned himself within earshot of Edward's chair approximately 20 minutes ago, with no explanation and no particular welcome extended or required. "They are framing her," Edward said quietly. "Yes," Henry said, "because of this evening." "Yes," Edward's jaw worked. "She helped me. That is the sum of her offense. She helped me off the floor and refused to be ashamed of it. I know. And so they are going to." He stopped, looked at his hands. "What are they using?" "A brooch, Lady Anne's, missing from the retiring room, which Clara did not take." "No," Henry said. "She did not." "Where is it?" Henry kept his eyes on the room. "I have a direction on that," he said quietly. "Give me a little more time." Edward turned to look at him fully. "Who are you, Mr. Gray?" The question landed with the weight of a man who does not ask things he has not already half answered. Henry met his brother's eyes. The recognition was there, had probably been there for some time, longer than Henry had believed, because Edward was not a man who missed things even when he chose not to name them. "Later," Henry said. "When?" "Before the end of the evening," Henry said. "I promise you that." Edward held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at the room, at Clara standing at the east wall with her hands still and her face composed, and the entire room's guilt pressing against her from three sides. "She is not going to beg," Edward said. "If they push her to beg, she will not do it." "I know," Henry said. "Then whatever you are planning," Edward said, "plan it faster." Sir Martin Vale found Clara at the east wall. He came with the expression of a man who dislikes conflict so thoroughly that he has learned to coat it in so many layers of social padding that it becomes almost unrecognizable as conflict, but is still underneath all the padding. "Conflict. Miss Bell," he said. "This is rather awkward." "I imagine it is," Clara said. "Lady Anne is very upset. The brooch has a great deal of. It was her mother's, you understand." He tugged at his cuff. "I wonder if you might. That is, it would set minds at ease if you would allow." "You want to search me," Clara said. Sir Martin winced. "I wouldn't phrase it." "That is what you want," Clara said. "To search my person and my effects, without any evidence connecting me to a missing piece of jewelry, because I am the least connected person in this room, and therefore the most convenient." "It isn't." "I was in the retiring room for 5 minutes," Clara said. "There were other women present. I do not know their names, but they can be identified. I went there directly from Lord Edward's side, where I had been standing for the preceding quarter hour, in view of 30 guests." She looked at Sir Martin. "I did not take Lady Anne's brooch. I will not submit to a search conducted on the basis of my income rather than any evidence, because doing so would imply I believe there is a reason to search me, which there is not." Sir Martin looked as if he had swallowed something unpleasant. "Miss Bell, I must strongly advise." "I know what you must advise," Clara said. "You must advise me to be quiet and compliant and grateful for the chance to clear my name by confirming everyone's worst assumption." "I understand the advice." She met his eyes. "I am declining it." Sir Martin retreated in the way of men who have no more tools available and are hoping someone else will take over the problem. Someone else was already there. Lord Peter Shaw found James Pike near the supper-room door. The exchange was brief. Clara was too far away to hear it, and the room was too loud for the words to carry. But she watched Lord Peter lean toward the footman, watched the footman go still, and watched Lord Peter's hand rest, casually, weightlessly, on the supper-room door frame in a way that enclosed the conversation without appearing to. The footman's face did something complicated. Lord Peter spoke again, lower. The footman looked at the floor. Lord Peter waited. The footman looked up and nodded. Lord Peter walked away. The footman stared at the wall for a long moment, then returned to his position and his careful blankness. And Clara watched him and thought, "He knows something, and he has just agreed not to say it." Caleb Stone found the footman 11 minutes later. He did not approach directly. Caleb was not a man who did things directly when indirect was available, but positioned himself at the supper room entrance under the pretense of inquiring about the evening's menu, a question the footman answered in monosyllables with the manner of a man in genuine distress. "You're Pike," Caleb said. "James Pike." The footman looked at him warily. "Yes, sir. I work for Lord Edward Ashford," Caleb said. "Not the house. Not any of the people currently having a very interesting evening in that room." He let that establish itself. "I'm going to ask you one question, and I'd like you to think carefully before you answer it. Not because I'm threatening you, but because the woman they're about to remove from this house did nothing wrong, and you appear to know that." James Pike's throat moved. "I didn't see anything," he said. "That's not one question," Caleb said pleasantly. "My question is, where is Lady Anne's brooch?" A long pause. "I don't know what you mean," James said. "You saw Lord Peter near the retiring room corridor earlier this evening," Caleb said. Not a question. Before Lady Anne made her announcement, the footman said nothing. "You saw what he did," Caleb said, "and Lord Peter just had a word with you about what you didn't see." James Pike looked at the wall. His hands were flat against his thighs. "I have a mother," he said, "and 2 sisters. This position is the only." "I know," Caleb said quietly. "I know exactly what this position is." He waited. "I'm not asking you to stand up in the middle of that room. I'm asking you to tell me where the brooch is. That's all. The standing up, that comes later, with support." James Pike looked at him for a long time. "Behind the 3rd panel in the cloakroom," he said, barely audible. "Lord Peter put it there during the 2nd dance. He put it in a small box behind the panel and told me if I said anything he'd see, I was dismissed without a character." Caleb nodded once. "Thank you," he said. He walked away without looking back. Henry had watched the exchange from a distance, had watched Caleb position himself, had watched the footman's posture go through its arc of fear and confession, had watched Caleb's unhurried departure, and felt the pieces of the evening assemble themselves into a shape he could now act on. He had what he needed. The brooch was located. The witness had spoken. Felix's mechanism was exposed. He looked across the room at Clara. She was standing at the east wall, where she had been standing for the past 20 minutes, and she was still composed, and she was still still, and she was watching the room with the patient endurance of a woman who has been here before, in different rooms and different configurations, and has learned that endurance, if nothing else, is entirely her own. Felix Crane had moved to the edge of the group surrounding Sir Martin Vale. His eyes were on Clara with the expression of a man waiting for a decision to be implemented. Henry's hand closed around the untouched glass. He should act now. He had the proof, he had the witness, he had the location of the brooch and the name of the man who placed it there. He could end this in the next 3 minutes. He looked at Felix. Felix leaned toward Sir Martin and said something. Sir Martin nodded unhappily. 2 footmen near the door straightened slightly. The subtle, attentive shift of staff receiving unspoken direction. And then Felix looked across the room. Not at Henry, not at anyone in particular, but at the door, and at Clara, and at the distance between them, with the expression of a man measuring the time remaining before a thing he planned is completed. Henry saw it. He's going to have her removed before the brooch can be found. Not later now. While the accusation was still unconfirmed, and the search was still theoretical, he was going to use Sir Martin's authority to have her removed from the house. And once she was outside the door, the accusation would solidify in her absence, and there would be no proof she had stood her ground, and no witnesses left in the room who hadn't already been managed. Henry set down the glass. He looked at Clara, who could not see Felix's face from where she stood, who did not know the footman had been directed, who was watching the room with the careful eyes of a woman who knows trouble is coming, and is simply waiting to understand its shape. Not yet, he told himself. If you act now, you stop tonight. But Felix walks out of this room, and Victoria walks out of this room, and the machinery runs again somewhere else, and Clara faces it without protection, and Edward. Felix nodded at Sir Martin. Sir Martin turned toward Clara. Henry stepped forward. He crossed the floor in the same unhurried pace Clara had used hours earlier, the pace of a person who has made a decision and is not performing. Urgency, because urgency is not the point. And he reached the group around Sir Martin Vale before the host had covered half the distance to the east. "Wall, Sir Martin," Henry said. Sir Martin stopped. He had the expression of a man who has been interrupted in the middle of an unpleasant task and is not entirely ungrateful for it. "Mr. Grey," Sir Martin said, "this is rather—" "I believe I have some relevant information," Henry said. "About Lady Anne's brooch." The group shifted. Felix turned from the edge of it. "Do you?" Felix said. His voice was flat. "I do," Henry said. He looked at Felix with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who has been watching someone for a long time and is no longer obliged to pretend he hasn't. "And about a chair that was moved this evening, and a cane that was removed." He paused. "And about several other details of tonight's events that I believe Sir Martin will find very useful." Felix held his gaze. Something moved behind his expression. A calculation, a reassessment, the particular focused alertness of a man who has just recognized that the terrain has changed. "You are a guest here," Felix said. "A minor acquaintance, I understand." "That is one description," Henry said. "And what business do you have inserting yourself into a private matter of Lady Anne's household?" Henry looked at him. "I have a great deal of business," he said, "as it happens." Across the room, Clara had heard the shift in the crowd's attention and was watching him with an expression he could not read. Somewhere between confusion and the particular wariness of someone who has learned not to trust rescues too quickly. He looked at her for just a moment. Then he looked back at the room. He was not ready to show his hand, not completely, not yet. But Felix had started moving toward the door, and there was a cane in the cloakroom and a brooch behind a panel and a frightened footman who had told the truth to one person. And if the room shifted correctly, if the evidence landed before the exit, tell it to more. Henry drew off his right glove. In the candlelight, the Ashford signet ring caught the light, gold and old, and unmistakable to anyone who had ever been presented at any house in the county. He did not announce himself. He simply stood with his hand at his side and let the light do the work. The nearest guests saw it first. Clara watched the room freeze. She did not know what they had seen. She could not see Henry's hand from where she stood. She only saw the freeze, the precise, spreading stillness of a room in which something has just been understood, and she watched it move outward from the group near Sir Martin like a current reversing, like weather changing mid-air. She watched Felix Crane's face. She had been watching Felix's face all evening and had learned its grammar. The pleasantness, the cold calculation beneath it, the controlled ease of a man who had never once believed he would be held accountable for anything he chose to do. She watched that expression change. It changed slowly, in the specific way of people confronting information they had not prepared for. A tightening around the eyes, a slight forward movement stopped mid-motion, a recalibration happening in real time and doing a poor job of hiding itself. He looked at Henry's hand. Then he looked at Henry's face. Then he looked for just a moment at the door. Clara looked at the man who called himself Henry Grey and understood, with the cold clarity of someone who has been standing in a burning room and has just been told it was on fire all along, that she did not know who he was, and that whoever he was, the room knew, and that the room's knowledge had just changed everything. Felix took one step toward the door. "Lord Felix," Henry's voice was quiet and carried completely. "I would prefer you remain where you are." Felix stopped. The ballroom was silent in the way it had been silent when Clara crossed the floor, except that this silence was different. That one had been the silence of a room, watching a woman do something it hadn't expected. This one was the silence of a room realizing it had been seen. Henry looked at Clara across the frozen ballroom. She looked back at him. She did not know his name. She did not know his rank. She did not know what the ring on his hand meant to the people around her, or why the room had gone so utterly still. She knew only that for the entire evening, while she had been standing in the open, taking every cost the night could charge, this man had been standing at the edge of the room, counting the damage. And she did not yet know whether that made him an ally or simply another kind of observer. The candles burned, the room waited, and Henry Ashford, Duke of Ashford, stood in the center of it and prepared to stop pretending he was someone else. He pulled the glove off, slowly, not theatrically. There was no flourish, no announcement, no pause designed for effect. Henry simply removed the glove the way a man removes something he has been wearing too long, turned his hand so the candlelight reached the ring, and let the room do the rest. The Ashford crest was old gold, deep cut, the kind of object that exists in a family for generations and accumulates, meaning the way stone accumulates weather. Slowly, completely, until the meaning and the object are indistinguishable from each other. Every person in that ballroom who had ever been received in polite society knew it. Every person who had ever attended a session of Parliament, read a gazette, or understood the architecture of English rank knew exactly what it meant and exactly whose hand it sat on. The silence came in a wave. It started with the guests nearest Henry and moved outward, a breath held here, a glass lowered there, a woman's fan closing mid-motion, until it reached the far walls and had nowhere left to go and simply settled over the room like weather that had decided to stay. Lady Agnes Shaw's mouth was open. Lord Peter Shaw had gone the color of old paper. Sir Martin Vale looked as if the floor had shifted under him, which in every meaningful sense it had. Henry stood in the center of it and said nothing for a moment, because the moment did not require him to say anything yet. And because it's spent the last several hours watching this room perform cruelty with great confidence, and he thought it could stand to spend 60 seconds in the discomfort of being seen doing it, he let the 60 seconds pass. Then he spoke. "I came to this house tonight as Mr. Henry Grey," he said. His voice was the same voice he had been using all evening, the same register, the same pace, but the room heard it differently now. The way rooms always hear things differently once they know who is speaking. The plain coat that had made him forgettable now made the room feel foolish for having found it so. The untouched glass, the careful position near the musicians, every unremarkable detail of the evening rearranged itself in the memory of every person present and arrived at the same conclusion. He had been watching. He had been watching all of it, and they had performed every moment of it in front of him. "I came disguised," Henry continued, "because I wanted to understand how this room behaves when it believes no powerful person is watching." He looked around the ballroom with the steady, unhurried attention he had been deploying all evening, except that now no one looked away from it. "I have my answer." The room did not move. "My brother attended this ball tonight under his own name," Henry said. "Lord Edward Ashford, whom several of you have known for years, whom several of you have visited at Ashford House, whom several of you have spoken of with warmth when rank was in the room." He paused. Tonight, without rank in the room, a chair was moved beneath him as he walked. His cane was taken from his chair and removed to the cloakroom. A piece of jewelry was hidden with deliberate placement, and its disappearance was announced in a manner designed to direct suspicion at the one person in this room who had done nothing this evening except act with courage. He looked at Felix Crane. These things were not accidents. They were not coincidences. They were planned. Felix had not moved from the spot where Henry's voice had stopped him. He had recovered some of his surface since the first shock. The pleasantness had not returned, but something harder had replaced it. the expression of a man who has been cornered and is deciding whether to negotiate or attack. His eyes moved briefly to Victoria, who was standing near the fireplace with her hands folded and her face giving nothing away, and then back to Henry. "That is a serious accusation," Felix said. "It is a serious evening," Henry said. "You have no proof of—" "The brooch," Henry said, "is behind the third panel in the cloakroom. It was placed there during the second dance by Lord Peter Shaw, who was observed doing so." He looked at Lord Peter, whose color had not improved. Lord Peter subsequently approached a member of Sir Martin's household staff and instructed him to remain silent about what he had seen. "That member of staff has already spoken to someone I trust." He paused. "The cane was retrieved from the cloakroom earlier this evening, where it had been deposited after being removed from beside my brother's chair. The chair itself was moved by Lord Felix Crane, deliberately, in the moment before my brother reached for it. The room had passed through silence into something deeper, the specific, compressed atmosphere of people who have been publicly catalogued in their worst behavior, and are waiting to find out how much worse the next minute will be. This is," Felix started, "documented," Henry said, "in detail, by more than one witness." He looked at Lord Peter. "Would you like to contest any part of it?" Lord Peter looked at the floor. Edward had not spoken. He had sat through Henry's recitation with the stillness of a man exercising considerable self-control over considerable feeling. His hands resting on the cane, Caleb had returned to him, his expression giving away nothing except to someone who knew how to read it. His jaw was set in the particular way it set when he was managing anger that he had decided was his to manage and no one else's. Henry had been watching him peripherally while addressing the room. He saw the moment coming before it arrived, the slight shift in Edward's posture, the decision crossing his face, and he began. "Edward, I would like to speak," Edward said. His voice was not loud. It carried completely. Henry stopped. The room looked at Edward. Most of the room had been carefully not looking at Edward for the past several minutes, in the manner of people who find that direct engagement with the subject of their recent cruelty requires more composure than they currently possess. Now they looked because the alternative was more conspicuous than looking. "Henry," Edward said, "I am grateful. I want you to know that." He met his brother's eyes, and something passed between them that was too old and too private for the room to read. "But you are describing what happened to me as though I am not present to describe it myself." Henry was quiet. "I was there," Edward said. "I was on that floor. I was the man whose cane was taken. I was the man Lady Agnes discussed behind her fan, and Felix Crane used as an evening's entertainment, and Lord Peter was happy to make an accessory to his schemes." He looked around the room, not with anger, but with the clear-eyed directness of a man who has decided that this particular room has had enough of his dignity and will not be receiving any more of it. "I do not require my brother to tell you what you did. You know what you did. You did it in front of me." No one spoke. "I want to say one thing," Edward said. "And I want it said plainly because I find that plainness is frequently the only language that survives an evening like this without being edited into something politer than the truth." He paused. "I am not a tragedy. I am not an inconvenience. I am not a lesson about kindness or a test of anyone's character or a problem that Henry's rank should be required to solve." His voice remained even. It was worse than if it had not. "I am a man who attended a ball and was treated as a joke by people who knew better and chose not to be. That is the plain truth of this evening. I wanted to say it myself." The room received this in silence. Lady Agnes Shaw's fan had not moved in several minutes. Lord Peter was studying the floor as if he had lost something there. Sir Martin Vale had the expression of a host who has realized that the evening he will be associated with for the rest of his social life is not the one he planned. Henry looked at his brother. Edward looked back at him. The old fracture between them, the guilt, the distance, The money sent in place of presents, the protection offered as a substitute for witnessness, was not resolved in that look. It was older than one evening and would take longer than one night to repair. But something in it had been named, and naming was the beginning of the rest. Caleb Stone entered from the cloakroom corridor. He walked directly to Henry, produced Lady Anne's brooch from his coat pocket, wrapped in a square of cloth, handled carefully, preserved exactly as found, and held it out. "Third panel," he said, "left side of the cloakroom. Behind a cedar box, not inside it." Henry took it. He turned and offered it to Lady Anne, who had been standing near the fireplace with the stiff composure of a woman who has realized that her announcement has been the instrument of someone else's scheme and is working out how she feels about that. She took the brooch without speaking, looked at it, looked at Lord Peter. Lord Peter had nothing left to look at but the floor. "Alice," Clara said. The name came from the edge of the room, and it came quietly. And it came from Clara Bell, who had been standing at the east wall through all of it, through Henry's revelation and Edward's speech, and Caleb's return, with her hands still, and her face carrying the particular expression of someone who has been through a great deal this evening, and is not yet certain it is over. Miss Alice Trent, standing near the second window, went very still. She was 19, a debutante in her first season, and she had been still for most of the evening in the way of young women who have been taught that stillness is safety. She had been near the retiring room. She had been in the corridor when Lord Peter came and went. She had stood in the group that first heard Lady Agnes's whisper and had not corrected it, not because she did not know it was wrong, but because she had not yet learned that the cost of silence is paid later and with interest. Clara looked at her across the room, not accusingly, not with the pressure of expectation, simply looked, in the way of a woman who has spent an evening being brave in the open and knows what it costs, looking at a young woman who has spent the same evening being frightened in silence and knows what that costs too. Alice Trent looked back. Then she looked at Sir Martin. "I was in the corridor," Alice said. Her voice was very small, and then, as if she had decided something mid-sentence, was not. "When Lord Peter came from the retiring room, I saw him go into the cloakroom. I saw him come out." She swallowed. "He was carrying something when he went in. He was not carrying it when he came out." Lord Peter said nothing. "Thank you, Miss Trent," Henry said. Alice looked at Clara. Clara nodded. Once the small acknowledgement of one woman to another who has just done a difficult thing and deserves to know it was seen. Felix Crane was removed from the ballroom by 2 footmen, who moved with the practiced quietness of staff who have been asked to do something by someone whose authority is not in question. He walked with the wooden dignity of a man who has decided that dignity is the only thing left available, and is spending every last piece of it on his exit. He did not speak. He did not look at Henry or Edward or Clara or James Pike, who stood near the supper-room door, and watched him go with the expression of a young man who has done something frightening, and is discovering that the other side of frightening is a particular kind of relief. Lord Peter Shaw followed, under no compulsion except the unanimous direction of every pair of eyes in the room, which had proved sufficient. Lady Agnes Shaw remained. She had not been asked to leave. She had not done anything that could be named in the specific way Felix and Peter's actions could be named. She has spread a whisper in the way she always spread whispers, and the room could not remove her for that, because the room had been participating in whispers like hers for 30 years, and was not prepared to face that accounting tonight. But she did not raise her fan again, and she did not speak, and the room around her was very quiet. Victoria left on her own. She did not wait to be asked and did not perform an exit. She simply gathered herself with the smooth efficiency of a woman who knows when a room has turned and does not wait for it to turn further, offered a murmured good night to Lady Anne, that Lady Anne received without warmth, and walked to the door. she passed Henry without speaking. She passed Clara. At Clara, she paused, just for a moment, just long enough to look at her, not with anger, not with the social violence of the earlier evening, but with something more complicated, the expression of a woman who has encountered something she did not account for, and is not yet certain what to do with that. Then she walked through the door. Clara watched her go. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something like triumph, the rightness of a thing resolved, the relief of weight removed. Instead, she felt the particular flatness that follows a long, expensive evening when the cost has finally been tallied, and the number is larger than expected. She was still employed, probably. Mrs. Hargrove had said nothing for the past half hour, and her silence had qualities that Clara could not yet read. She was standing in the middle of a ballroom full of people who had watched her be accused of theft and had not spoken up, and were now watching Henry Ashford speak with calm authority, and were rearranging their memories of the evening into versions more flattering to themselves. She was, and this was the part she was having difficulty with, the subject of the Duke of Ashford's visible regard, which the room had noticed and was interpreting in its own various ways, and which Clara did not know what to do with, because she had spent the evening learning who Henry Ashford was, and was still working out which parts of that knowledge to trust. She looked at him across the room. He was speaking to Caleb, quietly, with the ease of a man who speaks to his groom the way he speaks to anyone. He looked up. Their eyes met. Clara looked away first. She needed air. She needed 3 minutes without anyone watching her. She needed the dark and the cold, and a moment in which she was not a subject, or an accused woman, or a symbol of courage, or an object of pity, or a problem requiring resolution. She turned toward the garden door. She did not say where she was going. She did not look back. Henry watched her go, and something in his chest moved in the direction of following her. And he did not follow, not yet, because Edward was beside him, and Edward deserved more than an afterthought. And because Clara Bell had spent the entire evening making her own decisions and deserved the chance to make this one too. He would give her 3 minutes. Then he would find her. Edward stood beside him in the quiet left by Victoria's departure, and the room's subdued resumption of something that resembled a social gathering, though a quieter and considerably more chastened one. She left, Edward said. I noticed, Henry said. You should go after her. In a moment, Edward looked at him. Henry looked at his brother. They stood in the way they had not stood in a very long time, close, without the careful management of distance that years of guilt and years of pride and years of money sent instead of presence had accumulated between them. The fracture was still there. It would need time and honesty and more than one conversation to repair. But Edward was beside him, and they were looking at the same room, and that for tonight was a beginning. You should have told me, Edward said, that you were doing this. The past months, the other events. I know. I am not a project. I know that too. You were trying to protect me, Edward said. Not an accusation. A statement of fact delivered with the weariness of a man who has been protected in the wrong ways for a long time and knows the difference between protection and witness. But what I needed was not someone managing the room. I needed someone standing in it with me. Henry was quiet for a moment. I know, he said. I am sorry, Edward. Edward looked at the garden door where Clara had gone. She stood in it, he said. She had nothing, no rank, no history with me, no reason except the plain fact that it was right, and she stood in it. I know, Henry said. Go, Edward said, before she talks herself into leaving entirely. Henry looked at him. I'll be here, Edward said. I'm not going anywhere. A pause. And Henry, do not manage her either. She won't stand for it. I had noticed that, Henry said. Edward's mouth moved in the full smile this time. Arrived at, completed, real. Henry left. The garden was cold and very dark and exactly what she needed. Clara had taken the side door. the one near the retiring room that opened kitchen garden rather than the formal terrace, the door that guests did not use because it was narrow and unlit and smelled of rosemary and damp stone, and she had walked until the ballroom noise was muffled and the cold had reached her properly, and then she had stopped near a low wall and pressed both hands flat against the stone and breathed. Her hands were shaking. She had not known they were shaking until she pressed them down and felt it. Throughout the entire evening, the fall, the accusation, Victoria's composure, Felix's threats, the corridor, the east wall, the long hour of being treated as guilty, her hands had been still. She had noticed the stillness and been obscurely grateful for it. It had felt like proof that she was managing. The shaking, she understood now, had simply been waiting until she was alone. She let it run its course. The garden was a kitchen garden in the practical sense. Rows of something, low and winter bare to her left, a wall of espaliered fruit trees to her right, the smell of turned earth and cold rosemary and wood smoke from a chimney somewhere overhead. Not elegant, not designed for the contemplation of people escaping balls. It was a working piece of ground, and Clara found that she preferred it to the formal terrace, where she would have been visible from the upper windows and still performing something. Even if only solitude, she was very tired. Not the tired of a late evening, the tired that comes from spending hours inside a situation that requires you to be larger than your fear, which is a different kind of expenditure. It comes from somewhere deeper than sleep can reach and takes longer to repay. She heard the door. She did not turn around. She knew the footstep. She had been hearing it all evening, quiet, deliberate, the step of a man who moves through rooms without announcing himself, and has spent years getting very good at it. "Miss Bell," Henry said. "Your Grace," Clara said to the espaliered trees, a pause. "You know then," he said. "The ring," she said. "I saw it when Caleb brought the cane back. I was at the wrong angle to see it earlier." She kept her hands on the wall. "Henry Ashford, Duke of Ashford." She said the name the way you say a thing you have been turning over and have not yet decided where to put. "Mr. Henry Grey." "Yes." "Both the same man." "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "You watched the entire evening," she said. "Yes, from the moment Edward arrived. From before that," he said. "I was there an hour before he came in." Clara absorbed this. "And you said nothing?" While Felix moved the chair, while the cane was taken, while Lady Agnes, she stopped, steadied herself. "You watched all of it and said nothing." "I watched all of it," Henry said, "and gathered every piece of it, so that when I acted, the mechanism was exposed completely, and not just interrupted." "That is a very reasonable explanation," Clara said. "Yes, it does not make the hour at the east wall any shorter." "No," Henry said, "it does not." She heard him come closer. Not close. He stopped a careful distance behind her. The distance of a man who understands that the person in front of him has been cornered twice this evening already and has no interest in adding to that count. "I owe you an apology," he said. "You owe Edward an apology," Clara said. "He was on that floor." "I have begun that conversation," Henry said. "It will take longer than tonight to finish, but it has begun." Clara turned around. She had not intended to. She had intended to keep the wall between them a little longer, keep the darkness and the cold as a kind of buffer. But she turned around because she had spent the entire evening looking at things directly, and this did not seem like the moment to stop. He was standing 6 feet away, still in the plain dark coat, the ring visible on his ungloved hand. Without the ballroom around him, he looked different. Less like a disguised duke, less like a hidden observer, more like a man who is standing in a cold garden at the end of a long evening, and has something to say that he has not yet worked out how to say. Clara looked at him. "What do you want, Your Grace?" she said. Not unkindly, simply directly, because directness was the only language she had left, and she was too tired to find another one. Henry was quiet for a moment. "I want to explain myself," he said. if you will allow it. You have a title and a household and every mechanism of English society at your disposal, Clara said. I don't think you require my allowance for very much. For this I do, Henry said. I find I require it specifically. She looked at him, then nodded. Once, the small permission of a woman who is listening, but is not committed to any response beyond that. Henry looked at the wall behind her. Not because he could not look at her. He had been looking at her all evening with a directness that the ballroom had noticed, and that he had not bothered to manage. But because what he was about to say required some consideration of the ground, the way things that have been thought about for a long time sometimes need a moment of lateral vision to arrive at. I began doing this 3 months ago, he said, attending events as Mr. Gray. I told myself it was for Edward, that I needed to understand what rooms he was walking into, what treatment he was receiving, what the actual temperature of society was toward him, rather than the performance society delivers to a duke. He paused. That was true, but it was not all of it. Clara waited. I have been a bad brother, Henry said, not in the ways that are easy to name. I have not been cruel. I have not been absent in the physical sense. I have visited, I have written, I have made certain every financial need was met. He looked at the wall. I have been absent in the harder way, the way that looks like care from the outside and feels to the person receiving it like management. He stopped. Edward needed me to stand in the room with him. I stood outside it and sent money instead, and told myself that was protection, and it was not. It was easier than being present. And I knew that somewhere and did not change it, because changing it required admitting that the reason I stayed at a distance was not only about protecting him. Clara was very still. When he was injured, Henry said, he was 12 years old. I was 19. I was the one who was supposed to be watching. He said it flatly, with the flatness of something that has been said internally so many times it has worn smooth. I was not watching. I was across the grounds with my own pursuits, and Edward fell, and I was not there. He looked at her. I have been managing that fact for 12 years. I have been very busy managing it. It is possible that the busyness has served a function beyond the obvious one. The cold was quiet around them. I came to these events as Mr. Gray, Henry continued, and I watched how rooms treated Edward, and I told myself I was learning something that would help him, and I was. But I was watching what happened when someone had no rank to protect them, no title, no family name. I was watching what the room did to people it had decided did not matter, because I wanted to understand what Edward experienced when I was not present. He paused. I did not expect to watch a woman I did not know cross a ballroom floor in 4 seconds, because a man was on the ground and no one else was moving. Clara looked at him. You were not. She stopped, started again. You were not watching me for any particular reason. Not initially, Henry said. No. And then? And then you were the only person in the room who acted without calculating the return first, Henry said. And I found I could not look away from that. The wind moved through the kitchen garden, cold and directionless. Somewhere above them, a chimney exhaled wood smoke. Clara looked at Henry Ashford, the Duke in the plain coat, the man who had spent 3 months in empty rooms with a glass he never drank from, the brother who had sent money instead of presents and knew the difference, and felt something complicated move in her chest. Not the complication of attraction, though that was present, and she was honest enough to know it. The complication of a woman who has learned that things offered freely are frequently not free, and that kindness from powerful men frequently has an architecture, and that gratitude is not the same as love, and pity is not the same as either. Your Grace, she said. Henry, he said. Please, Henry. The name sat differently than the title. She tried it once and left it there. I understand what you are telling me. I believe it is honestly meant. She looked at her hands, no longer shaking, and then back at him. But I need you to understand something in return. Of course. I have spent this evening being a symbol, she said. A brave woman, a courageous companion, a poor girl who shamed the rich by refusing to be ashamed. She said it without bitterness, but with precision. I have been those things tonight in the eyes of every person in that ballroom. And those things are not wrong exactly, but they are not me entirely. They are the shape the evening made of me. She met his eyes. I do not want to become a different kind of symbol. The woman the Duke of Ashford chose because she was brave. The poor companion elevated by gratitude. The story of a man who fell in love in a ballroom because a woman did one brave thing. Henry was quiet. One brave thing, he said. You know what I mean. I know what you mean, he said. And I want to tell you what I actually mean, which is different, if you will hear it. She waited. I am not grateful to you, Henry said. That is, I am grateful, obviously. You helped my brother when no one else moved. And you held your ground through an evening designed to break it, and those things have my gratitude entirely. He paused. But that is not what I am standing in this garden to say. He looked at her with the direct attention he had been directing at her all evening, except that now it was unmanaged, not deployed for observation or protection or strategy, simply directed, simply present. I watched you calculate the cost of every choice you made tonight, and make it anyway. I watched you refuse to beg when begging would have helped you. I watched you look at a room that had decided your poverty was evidence of your character, and declined to accept that verdict. He stopped. I watched you see my brother as a man, not a lesson, not a symbol, not a pity. A man. He was quiet for a moment. I have not been seen clearly by very many people. Rank prevents it, generally. People see the title and arrange themselves accordingly, and what they reflect back is never quite real. He looked at her. You did not know my title. You saw me as Mr. Gray, a minor nobody who had been watching too long and acting too late, and you said so, directly, in the first 30 seconds of our acquaintance. Clara felt something in her chest shift. You were watching too long, she said. I was, he said. You were right, and acting too late. Also right. A pause. I have been acting too late at several things for quite some time. I am attempting to correct the pattern. The door opened. Not the side door. The terrace door, further along the wall, the one that opened from the formal corridor. Edward came through it with the particular determination of a man who has decided to go somewhere and is not allowing his cane, or the cold, or the darkness to register as obstacles. He found them near the wall. He looked at Henry. He looked at Clara. He looked at the 6 feet of careful distance between them. Well, he said, that's something. Edward, Henry said. Don't, Edward said. Not unkindly. I'm not interrupting. I'm adding to it. He came to stand beside Clara, which placed him equidistant from them both, and he looked at Clara with the clear-eyed steadiness that she had come to recognize as simply how Edward Ashford looked at things he considered worth looking at directly. Miss Bell, he said. Lord Edward, she said. I want to tell you something, and I want to tell you plainly, because I have had enough of the other kind of communication for one evening. He adjusted his grip on the cane. You did not save me tonight. Clara opened her mouth. Let me finish, he said. You did not save me. I was on the floor. I have been on the floor before, and I will be on the floor again, in some sense, because the floor and I have an ongoing relationship that my leg has decided is permanent. He said it without self-pity, in the tone of a man making a factual observation about geography. What you did was something different. You crossed the floor before anyone else moved, and you helped me up without any of the particular theater that people usually attach to helping me, and then you stood beside me and looked at the room as though the room was the thing that needed explaining. He paused. You reminded them that I was there, not as a problem, not as a difficulty, as a person who had just been put on the floor by someone who thought it was amusing. He looked at her. That is not saving a man. That is seeing him. and those are not the same thing, and the second one is considerably rarer. And I wanted to name it correctly. Clara looked at Edward Ashford, 24 years old, standing in a cold garden with his cane and his Oxford education, and his clear eyes and his anger that had not diminished, but had been directed into something precise and clean, and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was closed. "Thank you," she said. "I am also," Edward said, with the slight elevation of expression that was his version of a smile, "giving my brother permission to be absurdly earnest at you for the next several minutes, if that is of any use. He has been practicing something in his head since approximately the supper room corridor, and I think it would benefit everyone if he were allowed to deliver it." Henry made a sound that was not quite dignified. "Good night, Miss Bell," Edward said. He looked at his brother. "Henry." A pause. "Don't manage it." He turned and walked back through the terrace door with the unhurried certainty of a man who has done what he came to do. The door closed. The garden was quiet. Victoria Crane had not left the house. She had left the ballroom. That part was true. But she had withdrawn to the small anteroom off the main corridor, where the fire was still lit, and the noise of the gathering was muffled enough to think, and she had stood by that fire for 10 minutes working through what remained available to her. Not much. Felix was gone. Peter was gone. The brooch was recovered, and the witness had spoken, and Henry Ashford was in the garden with Clara Bell, which meant the thing Victoria had spent the last 2 hours refusing to name directly was apparently real. She was not a woman who panicked. She had navigated worse than this. Not worse in terms of public exposure, but worse in terms of private recalculation, the kind of setback that requires rebuilding from foundations rather than patching a surface. She was good at rebuilding. She was good at patience. She was good at finding the angle that remained open when every other angle had closed. The angle that remained open tonight was narrow. She went back to the ballroom, not to Felix. Felix was not there, and would not be useful even if he were. She went to find Henry Ashford, and when she did not find him in the ballroom, she went to the main corridor. And when she saw the garden door at the end of the passage, she understood where he was. She went to the garden door. She did not open it immediately. She stood with her hand on the handle and looked through the glass panel at the 2 figures near the far wall. Clara Bell, with her hands no longer pressed flat against the stone. Henry Ashford standing at a distance that had become a different kind of distance than it had been when she first looked, and she understood the full shape of the thing she had not wanted to understand. She could go out there. She could interrupt. She could deploy the last available tools, her family name, her connections, the social argument that Clara Bell was unsuitable, and that whatever Henry felt in a cold garden after an unusual evening was not the same as what would serve him in the long run, in the daylight, in the actual machinery of his life. She was good at that argument. She had been preparing versions of it all evening. She looked through the glass. Clara was speaking. Henry was listening with the full, undivided attention of a man who has stopped managing the conversation and is simply in it. And the thing that Victoria recognized, standing at the glass with her hand on the handle, was that the argument she had prepared was not wrong exactly. It was socially coherent. It would land in the daylight. It contained real points about real things. But it was the wrong argument for what she was looking at. What she was looking at was not a man being naive about a pretty poor girl. What she was looking at was a man who had spent months in plain clothing in empty rooms trying to understand something, and had found it, and was looking at it directly, with both eyes, with his rank left at the door. Victoria took her hand off the handle. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she straightened, collected herself with the precision of long practice, and walked to the main entrance and asked for her coat and went home. She did not slam a door. She did not make a scene. She did not give the house anything to discuss beyond her departure. She was whatever else she was, not a woman who made scenes she had not planned. "I want to ask you something," Henry said. "You may ask," Clara said. "I reserve the right to answer as I choose." "That is all I could reasonably hope for," Henry said. He looked at her with the direct attention that was. She was beginning to understand simply how he looked at things when he had stopped pretending to be Mr. Gray. "Will you allow me to call on you, properly, with every relevant fact on the table, and no disguises in operation, and whatever the actual terms of your life are fully accounted for?" Clara looked at him. "That is not the speech Edward said you'd been preparing," she said. "No," Henry said. "That one was longer and considerably more formal, and I abandoned it approximately 2 minutes ago because it was the wrong kind of thing, and you would have seen through it immediately." "I would have," Clara agreed. "This is what I actually mean," he said. "I am not offering you protection. I am not offering you elevation. I am not offering you a story about a poor woman rescued by a duke because she was brave one night in a ballroom." He met her eyes. "I am asking whether you would like to spend more time with a man who has been getting several important things wrong for a long time and is attempting to correct them, and who found tonight that the person he most wanted to talk to about the difficulty of being seen clearly was the one person in the room who appeared to have solved that problem entirely." The cold settled around them. Clara looked at Henry Ashford, who had come to a ball in a plain coat with a false name and an empty glass, and the particular guilt of a man who loves someone he has failed and has not yet worked out how to stop failing them, and felt the complicated thing in her chest resolve into something simpler, not simple, simply simpler. "You should know," she said, "that I have very little. My situation is genuinely precarious. My aunt depends on me. My employment tonight is uncertain." She said it without apology, because it did not require apology, only accuracy. "I am not telling you this to perform humility. I am telling you because you said every relevant fact on the table, and those are relevant facts." "I know," Henry said, "and you are still asking." "I am still asking," he said. "The facts about your circumstances are not a problem to be solved before I am allowed to know you. They are part of who you are. I am asking to know you." He paused. "The rest can be navigated, if you are willing to navigate it." Clara was quiet for a long moment. The garden was cold. The kitchen garden smelled of rosemary and turned earth. Above them the chimney exhaled, and the windows of the Vale house glowed amber against the dark. And inside that glow the gathered guests were conducting the slow, subdued reassembly of an evening that had gone considerably differently than anyone planned. Clara thought about the east wall, the half-step Mrs. Hargrove had taken, the way Lord Peter had looked at the floor, the way Alice Trent's voice had gone from small to not small in the middle of a sentence. She thought about Edward's face when she had said, "I did not offer pity, I offered witness." She thought about Henry Gray at the window with his untouched glass, watching, counting, collecting, and about Henry Ashford in this garden, not watching, not collecting, simply standing 6 feet away in the cold, asking a question and leaving the answer entirely to her. "Yes," she said. Henry was still. "Yes," she said again, more clearly, because she had made the decision, and decisions of this kind deserved a clear voice. "You may call on me, with every relevant fact on the table." She looked at him. "And I will tell you when you are managing things, and you will attempt to stop." "I will attempt," Henry said. "I cannot promise complete success. It is a deeply ingrained habit." "I am aware," Clara said. "I watched you manage an entire ballroom for 4 hours." "To moderate effect," Henry said. "To considerable effect," Clara said. "When you finally acted," the corner of his mouth moved. Not the controlled expression of Mr. Gray, not the ducal composure of the ballroom, something more unguarded than either. "You said I was acting too late," he said. "You were." "I am attempting not to repeat the error," he said. She looked at him. "I noticed," she said. They walked back through the terrace door together, not touching, not performing anything for the corridor, or the house, or the remaining guests, simply walking through the same door at the same time, which was its own kind of statement, and both of them knew it. Edward was in the main corridor. He looked at them. He looked at the space between them, which was smaller than it had been in the garden, and at their expressions, which were different from the expressions people carry when nothing has been resolved, and he nodded once with the satisfaction of a man whose instincts have proven correct. "Miss Bell," he said. "Lord Edward," Clara said. "I expect we will see more of each other," he said. "I expect we will," Clara said. "Good," he said simply. "You are considerably more interesting to talk to than most people Henry brings to Ashford House." "Edward," Henry said. "It is a compliment," Edward said. "To both parties." He looked at his brother. "The carriage is ready when you are. I have had enough of this ballroom." He glanced back at the amber-lit room, where the guests were finishing their wine and their recalibrations and their careful revisions of what they had thought and done, and said, "I believe this house has had enough of me as well." "I believe you are right," Henry said. Edward moved toward the entrance, then stopped and turned back to Clara. "Miss Bell," he said, "one more thing." "Yes?" "The next time someone tells you to remember your place," he said, "I hope you tell them you did, and found it perfectly adequate." He considered. "Perhaps with less politeness than that, but the general direction." Clara felt the smile arrive before she had decided to let it. "I'll take that under advisement," she said. Edward nodded. "Walk to the entrance." Henry looked at Clara. "May I see you to your aunt?" he said. "You may," Clara said. They walked through the corridor together toward the main room, where Mrs. Ruth Bell was sitting near the window with the expression of a woman who has spent the last hour in the grip of severe anxiety and is only now beginning to understand that the shape of the evening has changed in a direction she had not dared predict. She looked at Clara. She looked at the Duke of Ashford walking beside her. She said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say, and Clara reached her and took her hand and held it. For a moment, the small, quiet communication of two women who have been through a difficult thing, and are, both of them, still standing. Henry Ashford had come to the Vale Ball to answer a question. The question was a simple one, built over months of plain coats and empty glasses, and careful positions near the musicians. What did people become when they believed no powerful person was watching? He had his answer. They became, most of them, smaller. They became the version of themselves that had always been there under the manners, the cruelty that politeness kept in its coat, the cowardice that deference disguised, the willingness to look away from a man on a floor, because looking away cost nothing, and looking toward him cost a great deal. But he had also seen something he had not been looking for. He had seen a woman in a plain dress calculate the cost of a thing in 3 steps and pay it without ceremony. He had seen a young footman decide, in the space of 60 seconds, that the truth was worth the fear of saying it. He had seen a girl's voice go from small to not small in the middle of a sentence because someone else had gone first. He had seen his brother look at a ballroom from a chair and refuse to be diminished by it, and had seen what it cost him to do that alone, and had understood, standing in his plain coat with his untouched glass, that he had been making his brother do it alone for 12 years. He had come to the ball to test the world. He had not expected the test to expose himself. He had not expected to stand at a window and watch a woman he did not know act with the kind of unperforming, uncalculating moral clarity that he had been looking for in every plain-coated evening, and had not, until tonight, found anywhere except in the person he was supposed to be watching for it. He had come disguised to understand what people were without rank. He had learned what he was without it. And he had learned, in a cold kitchen garden that smelled of rosemary, that the thing he had been looking for, the person who would see clearly and speak plainly, and refuse the wrong kind of care and stand in the open, when the open was expensive, had been standing at an east wall all evening, waiting to be looked at directly. He had taken too long. He was attempting not to repeat the error. The Vale house burned amber in the winter dark as the carriages came and went. Somewhere inside it, Lady Agnes Shaw was reconstructing her version of the evening into one in which she had always found Clara Bell admirable. Somewhere inside it, Sir Martin Vale was telling his wife that he had suspected the truth all along. Somewhere inside it, James Pike was standing at the supper-room door with the particular expression of a young man who has done a frightening thing, and discovered that the other side of frightening is, in fact, a kind of ground. And in a carriage moving away from the Vale house on a cold November road, Edward Ashford sat opposite his brother and said nothing for a long time, which was the most comfortable silence they had shared in 12 years. Then he said, "She's going to tell you when you're wrong." "I know," Henry said. "Frequently," Edward said. "I expect so." "Good," Edward said. "You need it?" Henry looked out the carriage window at the dark fields moving past. "Edward," he said. "Henry." "I am sorry," Henry said. "For the years I managed instead of witnessed. I am sorry." Edward was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "I know you are." He looked at the dark fields too. "We will talk about it. Properly. Not tonight. Tonight has been sufficient, but properly." A pause. "You will not manage that conversation either." "I will try," Henry said. "Trying will do," Edward said. "For now." The carriage moved through the dark. The Vale houses grew smaller behind them, and then disappeared entirely. And the night came in from all sides, cold and clear, and full of the particular quiet that follows a long evening after it has finally, fully ended. Henry Ashford had entered a ballroom disguised to test the world. He left knowing his heart had already chosen. What would you have done if you had been standing in that ballroom? If you had seen the chair move and the man fall and the laughter come before anyone helped? Would you have stayed at the wall, or would you have crossed the floor? Clara Bell crossed the floor. She knew the cost and she paid it, and the thing she found on the other side was not reward, not rescue, not a story about a poor woman elevated by a rich man's gratitude. It was something older and simpler and harder to come by than any of those things. It was being seen clearly by someone who had finally stopped pretending not to look. That is the thing about courage in a ballroom, or a corridor, or a cold kitchen garden. It does not announce itself. It does not wait for conditions to improve. It crosses the floor in the time it takes a room to decide not to move, and it stands in the open and looks at what is plainly there, and it refuses, quietly, completely, at whatever cost, to pretend that it isn't. Some rooms never forgive that. Some people never forget it. Thank you for spending this evening at the Vale Ball. If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. Please like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Your support makes more stories possible. Until next time.